The Dark Woods. Joe was living in a group home in a small northwestern community in Illinois. He had moved here in the second semester of his sixth grade year. The adjustment was hard, but luckily for him, he had made friends with a girl his same age named Ashley. And what was even better, Ashley lived close by. The group home sat at the edge of town. It had a very large yard that was mostly surrounded by woods, and on one side was a small city park, and a stone's throw from the park was a large cemetery. Now, Joe had very little interest in the park, but he liked exploring the graveyard. His greatest interest was the dark woods. Joe was pretty restricted in his movements. He was allowed to ride his bike around the cemetery and on Highland Avenue. He had also been given permission to explore the dark woods. Ashley lived on the other side of the dark woods, so by a stroke of luck, his newest friend lived close by. Ashley was quite the tomboy, so she loved the dark woods. At the beginning of the summer break, Joe and Ashley explored and played in the woods. Climbing trees was their biggest pastime. One day, they decided to ride bikes in the cemetery. As they approached the oldest section of the cemetery, they spotted a rather tall, red-headed girl. She actually looked about their age. Joe was excited at the prospect of adding a third friend to their small group. Joe was just at that age when he had started noticing girls in a different way. Without looking at Ashley, he asked her out loud, "Do you know that girl?" After a few seconds, he turned around and looked at Ashley, and what he saw in her face was fiery determination. This was confusing for Joe, so he asked her the same question. Still not getting a reply, Joe looked back at the red-headed girl who was now staring back at Ashley with a very fierce look as well. It's worth mentioning, Ashley was also a redhead. Joe asked the question 3 more times. Still no answer from Ashley. Finally, Joe reached over and snapped his fingers in front of Ashley's face. This brought her back to reality. Softly, Ashley finally answered, "I don't know her, but promise me you'll stay away from her." Promise me? Joe thought. He was utterly confused, but in that second, he decided to go and meet this redhead girl. As he started toward the red-headed girl, about halfway to her, he had the urge to turn around and look at Ashley. When he did, he saw Ashley was in tears. Shocked, Joe suddenly felt a tap on his shoulder. Joe turned around, and standing in front of him was the red-headed girl. She reached out for a handshake. "My name is Summer," she said. "What's yours?" Joe blurted out his name, and after a few minutes of small talk, Joe turned around to wave Ashley over, but Ashley was gone. The rest of the day, Joe and Summer hung out in the dark woods. And for the next 5 days, Joe and Summer also hung out in the cemetery and the dark woods. Joe was kind of mad at Ashley for leaving that day, and was even madder that she hadn't been around in a week almost. But deep down, he was worried about her, and he missed her company. Summer was very nice and funny, but she was far different from Ashley. Not a tomboy at all. She would go into the dark woods for a short time, but Summer preferred the cemetery much better, and Summer absolutely refused to climb a tree. One day, when Joe got Summer to enter the dark woods, he told her he was going to climb his favorite tree. Summer didn't like him doing this. Too dangerous, she would say. But Joe loved climbing trees. His favorite tree was super tall. Joe had never attempted to climb all the way up, and as he reached his maximum height, he felt, then heard movement far above him. As he looked up, he saw Ashley staring down at him. She was waving for him to climb closer to her. For 10 minutes or so, Ashley and Joe talked and made up. Ashley instructed Joe to climb down and escort Summer back to the cemetery, and at his earliest convenience, make an excuse to return home. As Joe took Summer back to the cemetery, Summer was very quiet, but finally spoke. "Why are you betraying me? Why?" Joe didn't know what to say, so he made up a feeble excuse and turned around and headed for home. At a distance, Joe felt a sudden wash of chilled air, then lights out. When Joe woke up the next day in his bed, He couldn't remember anything. At breakfast that morning, his foster dad told him what had happened. He said, "We started looking for you about 7 p.m. It took us till 9 p.m. before we located you in a field a half mile away. That's when we carried you home and called the doctor. I don't know how you ended up in a field a half mile away and unconscious. That in itself is very disturbing. But as of today, you're grounded to the yard. No dark woods, no cemetery, no park for 2 weeks." Now, Joe was upset, but rules are rules. He decided to fully obey. It was early July, and he couldn't wait to see Ashley again. Every day of those 2 weeks, Joe would spot Ashley at the edge of the dark woods waving at him. And every day he would also see Summer in the graveyard waving at him. Finally, the 2 weeks were up. Joe re-entered the dark woods. Secretly, every day of those 2 weeks, Ashley and Joe had left notes for each other on a designated tree at the edge of the dark woods. So, Joe was expecting to see Ashley right away, but he didn't, although Joe was not overly concerned. Instead, Joe headed for his favorite tree. As he was climbing, he saw a short noose hanging on a large branch just above him. This stopped Joe mid-climb. Then he heard movement far above him, then a chilling, giggling sound. Then Joe saw her far above him, moving swiftly down the tree. Thankfully, Joe was faster. That night, Joe heard banging on the front door. Then he noticed flashing lights all around outside by the dark woods. At this sight, Joe's heart sank, and he knew. Ashley, she was never seen again. Joe lived in Erie 2 more years, but he never set foot in those dark woods again, nor the park, nor the cemetery. In 2020, 37 years later, Joe went back to Erie. He wouldn't go into the dark woods, but he skirted the outside edge. As he walked just inside the woods, there was a red-headed girl matching his pace. As Joe was returning to his car, he looked in the direction of the cemetery, and he saw a familiar face from his past waving at him. Joe smiled and waved back. When the Leaves Whistle. Quincy, Illinois, is a picturesque river town on the Mississippi River. It holds many secrets buried beneath its old streets. Her name is Canny. This is her story. In 1889, Canny was working in a factory near her home. She was just 11 years old. She would wake at 4 a.m., be at work by 5 a.m., and then work till 5 p.m., 6 days a week. It was a hard life, to say the least. Canny had learned to live inside her mind. This helped her deal with the circumstances of her life. Many evils lurked in the dark spaces around Quincy. Canny lived at the corner of 7th and Kentucky. Halfway down the block was the church she attended. On the side of the church sat a very large tree. Yes, Canny lived a very limited existence. She worked 4 blocks away. 21 people lived in her home. She had a very tiny room in the attic at the front of the house. She did have her own window, though. She only had one friend. His name was Woody. It's a silly name, but you see, her only friend was a big tree in the churchyard. Now, she never climbed this tree out of respect. But every day, no matter what the weather was doing, she would sit and visit with Woody, her very best friend, her only friend. Many nights her father or grandfather would come and carry her home because she would fall asleep under the big tree. Her grandfather, being a very superstitious man, remarked on many occasions, "It looks like that big tree is protecting her. It's an odd sight indeed, it surely is." At the beginning of 1889, strange things started happening to young girls that worked in factories. Someone in Quincy was kidnapping them after work. They would keep them for a few weeks and then let them go. It was very odd that this person would let them go, but that's not all. He would cut off both hands at the wrists. Then he would remove their tongues. and gouge out their eyes. Why would this sick individual do these strange things, but let the girls live? This person attended to their wounds so that they would live. It perplexed everyone in Quincy. It was a great mystery, a sick, grotesque, unnatural, vicious crime. One day, Canny asked Woody why this individual was doing such things. It's guessed that Woody did answer her question. The next day, after work, Canny went to the police department. She told the amused desk sergeant the answer which everyone was seeking. This sick individual does these things because the girls can never identify him. This simple in-your-face answer. It intrigued the town. Canny became someone noticed for the first time in her life. Unfortunately, this sick individual took notice of Canny as well. This individual watched Canny for a few weeks. Then, one morning, Canny was gone. Her attic room window had been removed, and the individual took her in the middle of the night without a sound. 2 weeks later, Canny was found sleeping underneath the big tree. Her tongue removed, her hands removed, and her eyes were removed. Unfortunately, Canny died a few weeks after her return. But every day she visited her best friend. Her last day on this earth, she was found far up in the big tree. On a strong branch, Canny had died. Above her, carved into the trunk of the tree, was this: Canny and Woody, best friends forever and ever, 1889. Today, Canny's house still exists, the old church still exists, and Woody still exists. Many carvings have been discovered under the carving from 1889. No names, just 18 more inscribed years, with the last being 1975. Now, in 1975, a young woman, 18 years old, died in a mysterious tragic accident while at work. Unbelievably, she worked in the same factory as Canny, lived in the same house that Canny had, even had the same room as Canny had. Coincidence? Maybe. You be the judge. Or maybe you can do like Canny and just ask Woody for the answer. Unwanted seclusion. In 2014, I bought an abandoned farmhouse outside the small town where my grandfather had grown up. When I was growing up, he always talked about his hometown. He had many great stories and memories to share. Back at the time, I noticed my grandma didn't care much for him telling us these stories. One time when I was older, I asked my grandma why he talked about his hometown so much. Grandma said he left when he was 18 and had never returned. I asked why, but she did not know the answer. So one day, I asked Grandpa, why had he never returned to his hometown that he was obviously so fond of? At first, I didn't think he was going to answer me. And then I noticed his face, that was usually jovial, change instantly to a mask of deep pain buried for a long time. Finally, he answered. When I was 12 years old, we had a woman come to stay with us. We lived on a farm about a mile from town. I was the youngest, and only my sister, that was 16, still remained at home. Our house was not really big, but at the same time, it was not small. Upstairs had 2 decent-sized bedrooms, one for the boys, one for the girls. Oddly enough, though, the upstairs did contain 2 rooms that were never used. Whenever we kids asked about the unused rooms, we would be scolded and reprimanded harshly, so the subject was rarely brought up. The windows to these rooms had been boarded up, as well as the doorways. Sometimes at night, if we listened closely, we could hear odd sounds coming from these rooms. It scared us kids immensely. A year before, my parents had been killed in a horrible car accident, and my father's sister and her husband had moved in to take over the farm and take care of us. My sister and myself were told the woman coming to stay with us was a relative and that she was really old. We were also told to leave this woman alone. Now, I was a curious sort, so I asked my aunt many questions about this mysterious old woman. Finally, my aunt relented and answered some of my questions. Apparently, this woman had grown up in this very house many decades ago, but had left one night never to return. It was assumed long ago that she had died, but last year, after your parents died, we received a letter from her. In that letter, she asked if she could finally return home to live out her last days among family. Me and your uncle responded, telling her that she was indeed welcome to come back here and live. I asked, how was she related to me? My aunt said, she's your great-grandfather's sister. That makes her your great-great-aunt. I knew my great-grandfather had died many years before I was born. I thought to myself, she must be really ancient. The day she arrived, I did indeed see that she was really old, but her eyes, they were sharp and alert. I met her gaze for only a moment before I had to look away. A week before she arrived, my uncle took the boards off both the doorways and windows to the unused rooms upstairs. My aunt had cleaned and made up both rooms. I was hoping to finally see inside these rooms, but when I finally had the chance, they were both locked. For the first few weeks the old lady was here, I never saw her leave her room. My aunt always brought her meals to her. My bedroom was adjacent to the room the old lady had chosen to stay in. Deep into the night, I could hear her mumbling gibberish. Then she would stop. Then she would tap on the wall very softly. Then she would stop. Then I would hear her door slowly creak open. Then I would hear the door for the unused room across the hall slowly creak open, then close. Then, for the rest of the night, I would hear nothing. This would happen night after night. I wondered, what was she doing? Finally, one day, when I was heading to my room, I noticed the bedroom where the old lady stayed was slightly ajar. Previously, it was always closed. Before I could enter my room, the old lady softly said my name. And then she said, come in and talk for a while. I was scared, but my curious nature took over. So I entered the old lady's room that afternoon. Instantly, I noticed each hand of hers only contained the middle finger and thumb. It was odd and scary to look at. That afternoon, she told me a story I'll never tell another living soul. This story is beyond comprehension. Every word is vile and horrible. I never visited the old lady's room again. Every night, though, she would talk to me through the wall, but I never listened. 4 days before my 18th birthday, something horrible happened. After the old lady had moved in, my sister had changed drastically. Her old self was outgoing, fun-loving, and spontaneous. She was very beautiful and popular. But that all changed. Her grades suffered. She was no longer outgoing. She only stayed in her room. And after a while, her hair started falling out. And her once beautiful face had turned into someone twice her age. When you looked at her, her eyes were blank, like most of her soul had already departed this earth. She was a grim sight to behold. Oddly, through all of this, the old lady seemed to get better. One day, my aunt had entered my sister's bedroom in the morning. My aunt had let out a scream. I'm sure people in town probably heard it. When I rushed into my sister's room, I saw her sitting in her chair. All her hair was missing, and her face was a mask of absolute pain. Both hands were missing 3 fingers. 2 pairs of scissors had been jabbed into each eye socket. At her feet, a slow trickle of blood still dropped onto the floor. When I stepped into the hall to catch my breath, the door to the old lady's room opened up just slightly. I saw 1 finger, a middle finger, curled around the door. But it was not the finger of old age. It was the finger of someone far, far younger. Then I saw 1 youthful eye looking back at me. Then I heard a mirthful giggle. Then the door slammed shut. The day of my sister's funeral, I left and I never returned. Move-in day, 2014, I was excited. I'd bought the house unseen in person. I'm 28 years old. It's been my dream to restore an old home, marry, and start a family. This old farm outside my grandfather's hometown was so cheap, I couldn't pass up buying it. My girlfriend, who was moving in with me, was not as excited as I was. In fact, I don't think she liked the idea at all. Moving all the way from Portland, Oregon to a small town in western Pennsylvania didn't seem smart to her. When I arrived, I noticed the house looked different than it did in the photos. There were 4 windows at the back of the house, boarded up. When I entered the house, I immediately went upstairs. It was a strange feeling that I was having. Something I remembered from my youth was bubbling up. A sense of deja vu, or maybe an old memory resurfacing. As I looked down the hallway, I saw 2 open bedroom doors. Then, farther down, I noticed 2 bedroom entrances that were completely boarded up. I slowly approached one of the boarded up doorways. Then I heard an ancient, gravelly voice lightly say this: "Finally, you come home?" Then the voice said my grandpa's name. It was in that same moment that I remembered the story my grandpa had told me all those years ago. It was then, also in that moment, that I realized I had made a terrible mistake. The boards on each enclosed doorway started to rattle furiously. Then I felt something behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks. This something behind me put its hand around my face, then slowly pulled it away. When it did, I only felt 2 fingers. My last thought was, well, I wished for seclusion, but this is unwanted. Eyes linger. Nance was a strange little girl. If you talked to her, she seemed normal. But if you looked at her, especially into her eyes, something behind those eyes, maybe beyond those eyes, was not quite right. Most people that talked with her avoided direct eye contact. If you didn't, it was at your own peril. Nancy's family was fairly poor, but her father was a single-minded alcoholic. He worked very hard at getting out of work. This he did extremely well. He was also very good at seeing a quick and easy way to make money. He immediately saw Nance as a way to make money. Exploit is probably a better description. And his exploitation of it worked very well. Mostly. But sometimes it went very badly. Not for Nance or her father. Only for those who visited Nance. First, you must understand. Although Nance's eyes were grossly disfigured, her sense of the world around her was beyond extraordinary. She seemed wiser than the eldest of elders around, and far smarter than every teacher that ever visited her. To keen observer, Nance seemed to toy with her visitors. Most of the time, it was harmless fun. Other time, she liked manipulating her guests. This she did with great skill, manipulating people. It was a trait she inherited from her father, and that fact pleased him immensely. If she kept her father happy, she could do the thing she most enjoyed. Her favorite thing, though, was far, far, far worse than manipulating people. This thing went beyond that. This thing was deadly serious. When Nance was doing her favorite thing, both her eyes would change different colors, and they would rapidly move around. Each eye seemed to have its own independent will and agenda. Also, when she was doing her favorite thing, she liked to whisper in her visitor's ear, so others observing could not hear her well. Nance could easily spot the weak-minded or people in crisis. One of her visitors went home, and over the course of some weeks would unbury the newly dead. He had to quit his job to engage in his nightly activities, but he still put meat on the table, in a manner of speaking. Of course, he was finally caught. His family blamed Nance for his strange, bizarre activity, but that charge never went anywhere. But people were starting to talk about the strange, cross-eyed girl in negative ways. Many other bizarre things befell Nance's visitors, but nothing was ever done. Of course, the authorities would warn her father. After a warning, the visits would stop for a short time, but this loss of revenue would infuriate her father. He would mistreat the girl day and night, but the next day she would wake up with no signs of the beatings done the day before. It scared the rest of the family to the very extremes. Now, Nance didn't really care for any of her family in a normal way. She toyed with them too. If a family member was brave enough to cross her, they would pay for this in some small way. Her father, however, seemed to not fear her. Mostly, he left her be, until her special thing brought unwanted trouble and headaches his way. As an alcoholic, all he cared about was his next drink. Nance understood she needed her father for outside protection. She needed him around so she could do her special thing. But Nance was biding her time until she was an adult, and she had the patience of many souls. Her father would have his day, and what a day it would be. The rest of her immediate family started to become insane, day by day, little by little. It was a slow process. Nance enjoyed watching it happen. Her eyes were the most pleased. It seemed Nance was the most content when both eyes seemed like they were looking at each other. It was a terrifying sight, and if you looked at her during these times, your own sanity would be touched. Central Illinois in the 1880s was quite settled. News about the strange cross-eyed girl called Nance spread quickly. Finally, one day, Nance decided to display her powers of beyond for a small audience. She was 11 at the time. A man in crisis was led in front of Nance. She made a request. It was that she be left alone with the man, without being observed. Her father reluctantly agreed. After 20 minutes or so, a small gathering of people waiting to see if Nance had made the man better heard some unholy shrills of pain. Her father reassured the small crowd that this happened from time to time, so they waited. Finally, after 10 more minutes, the small crowd filed into the viewing room. What they saw before them was beyond human belief. The man in crisis had removed his knife at some point and cut off his big toe. He was in the corner of the reading room, in a fetal position, gnawing on his big toe that he had cut off. A few feet away sat Nance in her reading chair. Since she started giving these readings, they had always shackled her to the chair. This time was no different. The people were absolutely horrified. News spread fast, and the authorities warned Nance's father again, just like dozens of times before. Except this time, her father didn't abuse her. For the first time ever, he was genuinely scared of Nance. The readings stopped for 2 months this time. 2 of Nance's siblings were taken away to the insane asylum. Her uncle cut his arm off at the elbow and fed his limb to the pigs. He died a short time later. Obviously, Nance was getting bored. Finally, her father set up a reading for her. It was a beautiful spring day. 5 adults and a young boy in some form of crisis or another showed up. They were all from Normal, Illinois. It was a small journey to where Nance and her family lived outside of Peru, Illinois, on a small farm along the river. The young boy, named Paul, had been having strange nightmares. All the viewers took their seats in the viewing room. Then the young boy went into the reading room and sat across from Nance. Before every reading began, Nance would keep her eyes closed until her visitor or visitors were seated and they were alone. Usually, Nance would sit very still for a few minutes before she opened her eyes. This time, however, it was different. As soon as Paul entered the reading room, Nance started squirming. Her face became distressed. Then she opened her eyes. Both eyes were rolling every which way, turning different colors. The young boy, Paul, didn't seem distressed at all. He just stared at Nance. Nance started thrashing wildly in her seat. Then after a minute or so, she closed her eyes, and everything in the room went quiet. Suddenly, these words emanated from Nance. "Why don't you fear us, boy? Why? Why? Why?" Paul didn't move or respond. Then the steel chains that shackled Nance to her seat popped open, Nance stood up, her eyes rolling about in her head. She stepped a foot closer to Paul and let out a loud wail of terror. Paul didn't flinch. In that second, the reading room door flew from its hinges. Nance leapt through the door, wailing a god-awful sound. She ran at a ghostly speed and leapt into the raging river. Nobody has seen Nance since that beautiful spring day. Paul went back home with his family. He never had nightmares again. Locals say Nance and whatever those things were inside her finally met someone they were scared of. Only thing is, Paul was just a normal boy. From below. I grew up in an old farmhouse outside Canton, Indiana. The year is 1971. I'm 15 years old. My name is Jubal. I don't scare very easy. My mysterious nature prevents that. I am very wary of things around me, even the things that are familiar. I was scared real bad once when I was 7. I wandered into the forbidden woods not far from my home. Once inside the woods, it got dark very quickly. I stood very still. Something was stalking me. I couldn't hear it. I couldn't smell it. I couldn't see it. But I felt it in my bones. Then instantly, out of the dense brush, came 4 large coyotes. Normally, they would run away at the sight of a human, but not these 4. They were on a mission. Not because they were hungry. It was something else motivating them. I could see the vile intent in their eyes. I instantly turned and ran, but within seconds, I could feel them right behind me. Then I fell over a tree root. Instantly, I felt a sharp pain in my leg. I knew in a few seconds it would all be over. But it wasn't. I was expecting my demise at any moment, but it never came. I slowly sat up. 10 feet away, I could see the 4 coyotes growling very softly. Instantly, I felt someone behind me. The coyotes squirmed and whined, and after a few seconds, they turned around and disappeared into the thick woods. I slowly turned and saw a boy, about my age now, 15. However, the boy was transparent. He didn't speak. Neither did I, because I'm a mute. I was born without vocal cords. Then the transparent boy started moving his hands and arms. Surprised, I realized he was doing sign language. From that day in the woods, Beck has been my best friend. One day in mid-September of my freshman year in school, I noticed a new student. She was not really that pretty, but still cute in other ways. Her name was Priscilla. She didn't know sign language, so she did all the talking. It was always a one-sided conversation. One afternoon as we were walking home from school, I noticed Priscilla's mood darkened. Her smile turned to a frown. She quickly turned away from me. Then she spoke in a guttural tone. "Something watches you from below, Jubal." Then I saw Priscilla running towards the forbidden woods. I immediately followed her, but she was too fast. When I was 10 feet from the entrance of the woods, Beck stepped into my path. He signed, "Do not enter now." I trusted my ghostly friend, so I did not enter the forbidden woods. That night, I lay awake in bed, thinking about Priscilla. I thought to myself, did I make the wrong choice? Then I felt something below me. It was making a low hissing sound. Then I felt something moving under my bed, then slowly up the side, still hissing. I was laying on my side. The movement and hissing were now directly behind me. I turned over in a sudden movement, but nothing was there. I turned back over and closed my eyes. After a few minutes, I opened them to a ghastly sight. There it was, staring back at me, hissing. Priscilla never came out of the Forbidden Woods in 1971. Or did she? Death from Inside. Central Illinois, 1876. The small schoolhouse was ready for all its students this beautiful fall morning in October. The air was crisp, the leaves were falling, the teacher was getting everything ready for an average day. The teacher's name was Savannah. She was 21 years old, and this was her second year at the job, and so far she loved it. The job, that is. The schoolhouse was just like any other on the prairie, but something malevolent seemed to permeate its walls. She couldn't explain it, and she was too embarrassed to ask anyone about it. The thing that really stood out was a lone grave marker at the edge of the school property. It had no markings at all. Every time she thought about it, it made her feel positively ill. Many times, while she was in the school alone, she would hear hushed whispers from the darkened corners. She could never make out the words, which actually scared her even more. The only thing that scared her more than the schoolhouse, though, was Corey Vischer. He was a 12-year-old boy that attended the school. Since she started here last year, Corey stared at her relentlessly. He would only talk when asked a question, and even then it was only a few words. The way he stared at her, though, it scared her so much. At first she thought maybe the little boy had a crush on her, but after a few weeks, she decided it was something different. Something she didn't understand, or want to, for that matter. Finally, all the students arrived, except Corey. She asked one student if they had seen Corey. The young girl answered, "Yes, he's out standing by the old gravestone." Savannah went to the nearest window and looked out. Sure enough, Corey was standing by the gravestone. If it had been any other student, she would have called him inside. But Corey was different, she thought to herself. If he wants to stand out there, so be it. And good riddance. As the day wore on, occasionally Savannah would look out the window, and Corey was still by the gravestone. About 11 a.m., it started to get dark outside. All the children grew very silent. Savannah was shocked. Then she smelled something like burning hair. It was nauseating. And then it happened. About 12 p.m., a local farmer was passing by the school, and he noticed right away something was odd. All around the school was empty. The only thing he saw was little Corey Vischer standing by the old gravestone. He saw no one else around. He tied up his horse and headed for the front door of the school. Before he reached the first step, he had an overwhelming sense of dread. It invaded his whole being. He stopped dead in his tracks. Then he smelled something awful emanating from within the school. Without another thought, he turned to head for his horse. That was his final thought. Later that day, they found the local farmer hanging dead on the door of the school. 2 railroad spikes held him in place, one in each shoulder. It was a horrible sight to behold. Inside, they found not one body, but only the burnt imprints of the students and the teacher, burnt into the floor of the school. It was a ghastly sight. They found Corey Vischer laughing hysterically by the old gravestone. A few days after this, Corey disappeared, never to be seen again. The next day, the authorities nailed all the windows shut inside the school and nailed both doorways shut from the outside. A pastor blessed the schoolhouse, and they left. A short time later, they erected a wrought iron fence around the school property, and they also posted warning signs all along the fence. Stay out. Today, the schoolhouse still exists. So does the wrought iron fence and the old gravestone. Every few years, the locals put up fresh warning signs all along the fence, but that doesn't stop the thrill seekers. Since the school was closed up 146 years ago, 24 people, 24, have been found dead hanging from the school's front door, with 2 railroad spikes under each shoulder. The locals say Corey has been spotted over the years standing by the gravestone, laughing. If you feel courageous, stop by and have a chat with Corey. My Unwanted War. My name is Marty. I volunteered for the military in 1940. I was hoping for a spot far beyond the front lines if America did indeed enter the war. I'm not a coward, please understand, but I wanted to live a long life. My dreams were not answered. I was put in for the tank crew as a driver. I saw my first duty of combat in North Africa. Instead of being in the rear with the gear, I was the tip of the sword, in a manner of speaking. Each time we went into combat, I noticed a face would appear for only a fraction of a second in my driver's scope. It scared the wits out of me. I didn't mention this to the rest of the crew. The mocking was one thing, but facing a gruesome death in the heat of combat made tank crews very spooked. The face I would see was a young woman. As the war progressed, we fought in Italy, then finally France. We were considered a very lucky tank crew. This was considered a good thing, but for us it could also mean that our luck could run out any time. We'd escaped death on many occasions. Most of these times it was inexplicable how we did make it out alive. Over the course of time, the young woman that looked at me in my driver's scope, her image lasted longer now. It's hard to explain. I considered myself an amateur artist. After each battle I would draw a new picture of this mysterious girl. A few times the other guys saw me drawing the girl. They mocked me a little bit, but usually they left the subject alone. Of course, I never mentioned where the inspiration for the pictures came from. One of my crewmates started to change. He was once a very gregarious soul, but his moods were now very dark. He was still performing his job, but the rest of the crew, including myself, was wondering if his sanity was on the brink. Turley was his name. He was the weapons loader. If his sanity broke in the heat of battle, that could trigger our instant death. Over the course of a few weeks, we noticed Turley talked to himself more and more. I noticed more than others usually did. When I watched him closely, it seemed like he was listening for an answer from something or someone that wasn't there. It disturbed me immensely, but I didn't say anything, because I had my own secret. Sometimes I found myself questioning my own sanity. Finally, the Americans crossed the Rhine River. We were informed that in a few days a large battle was going to take place. Now that the Allies are on German soil, they will fight twice as hard to protect their homeland. The night before the battle, Turley cornered me away from the others. He whispered softly, "I know your secret. I know who she is. Do you want to know how I know?" Instantly, I tried to push past Turley, but it was useless. I felt something behind me, holding me in a steel grip. The thing holding me stank of putrid death, an odor beyond human conception. Turley, his eyes usually a light green, glazed over a dark black. My adrenaline finally kicked in, but it was still useless. The thing behind me still had me in a steel grip. Then the thing, with its rancid odor, spoke into my ear. I tried not to listen, but it kept speaking of horrible things to come. At this time, Turley just smiled, a smile that was inhuman. Then Turley tried to grab my sketchbook that was under my coat. When he did this, I felt a sudden wave of heat pass through my body. Turley had managed to grab the sketchbook, but in that second, I saw terrible pain across his face of malice. He dropped the sketchbook like it was on fire. In that same second, the rancid-smelling thing behind me let out an agonizing screech. Then I felt myself free of its grip. I dropped to my knees. All my strength was gone, but I used what effort I had left to pick up my beloved sketchbook. It was still warm to the touch, even through the thickness of the gloves I was wearing. Then, before I passed out, the girl that looked at me through my driver's scope came into view a few feet away. She had a look of deep concern on her face. And then I saw nothing more. The Lost Lane. It is the summer of 1981. It's unbearably hot in northwest Missouri. My name, or nickname, is Toad. I can't recall ever being called anything else. I can't see well, so my glasses are super thick, hence my nickname. I don't particularly like anybody around my hometown. The constant teasing eventually turns a person inward. This is where I have gone, not by choice, you understand, but by circumstances beyond my control. I'm actually a very friendly person, but that doesn't matter. My only friend, or the only person that would be nice to me anyway, is my babysitter. I'm 11 now, and Angie is 14. Angie is nice to me in private, but in public she barely registers my existence. I understand her dilemma. She comes from one of the poorest families in the area, so her trying to fit in is hard enough. Although being poor in this corner of the country is more common than common sense. My hometown is Skidmore, Missouri. It has one main road in and out. But many evils lurk in and around this small community. I ride my bike everywhere. I observe everything. Most events I write down in my journal. When people are not teasing me, they flat out ignore my existence altogether. That's the one advantage I have, and I utilize it all the time. Skidmore and the surrounding area has had a bully that terrorizes the public at large. The law is even scared of him. Everyone gives him a wide berth. He answers to no one, and if someone crosses him, there is hell to pay. Ken was an enigma to me when I was 8. I was in the local grocery store. I had just enough money for a candy bar and a soda, till some older kids accosted me. Taking my money, they'd pushed me to the floor. When this happened, my glasses went sliding across the floor. The older boys just stood there laughing at me. That's when I looked up and saw a big blur of a man standing above me. Even without my glasses, I knew it was Ken. The boys who had accosted me, they disappeared like a fart in the wind. I could feel Ken staring at me, sizing me up. It was only maybe 30 seconds before he spoke, but it felt like 2 hours. He said, "Reach out your hand, boy." I did as he said, trembling. I felt him put a paper bill in my hand. He said, "Get whatever you want, Toad. That's a $20 bill in your hand." My mouth trembling, I said, "Thank you, sir." All Ken did was grunt. Then a second later he said, "Toad, are these your glasses on the floor?" Eagerly, my mouth trembling, I said, "Yes, they are." Obviously, I thought he was going to give them to me, but I was wrong, terribly wrong. A few seconds later, I heard a loud crunching sound. Ken stomped on my glasses until they were obliterated. I was perplexed by this incident. But I became enamored with Ken, not in any way I could explain that would make sense. After I got new glasses that had a strap on them so they wouldn't fall off, I made it my mission to follow Ken wherever I could, whenever I could. I recorded his deeds and misdeeds in my notebook. Whenever I witnessed him doing something awful, after the deed was done, a girl with a gnarled-up body would appear beside him. She was grotesque in every way. The sight of her always scared me to the bone. In early May of 1981, I was out fishing after dark by the bridge. That's when I heard a vehicle slowly approaching to the middle of the bridge. Its headlights were out. Then it came to a slow stop. I heard a rustling sound. Then something dropped into the river. In that very second, I felt like something went missing from my life, but I didn't know what it was. But it was an awful feeling of sorrow and dread. Then everything went still. I could barely breathe. I heard a faint whisper. It said, "Kill him now." I didn't move an inch. As I squinted looking up at the bridge, I saw Ken loading a rifle, and beside him was the grotesque, gnarled girl pointing right at me. Before Ken lowered the rifle to shoot, I silently slid into the river, not making a sound. A few seconds later, I heard 8 shots fired. I stayed underwater, floating as long as I could stand it. I finally pulled myself out of the river, maybe a half a mile away. I was cold and scared. As I was walking down the side of the road, I spotted someone standing in the middle of the road, maybe 50 feet in front of me. After squinting for a few seconds, I realized it was Angie, but she looked different. She was sopping wet, but instead of looking at me, it seemed like she was staring at something far behind me. I slowly walked towards her. About 10 feet away, she raised her arm pointing behind me. Instantly, I heard a loud motor coming fast. I turned around and saw blinding lights speeding towards me. I turned around to face Angie, but she was now at the side of the road. Slowly she turned, heading toward the woods. Then what I saw changed me forever. The back side of Angie's head was gone. It was gone. It was gone. It was gone. This is what I was yelling when I woke up in the hospital in the middle of the night. I instantly realized my glasses weren't on. Then somebody touched my shoulder. I assumed it was the nurse. But then I realized the hand touching my shoulder was gnarled. Treasure in the woods. Enoch couldn't believe his luck one day while exploring in the deep woods. In a small clearing, he saw an old car sitting by itself. He rounded it very slowly. Enoch was a cautious person by nature. Enoch was 27 years old, the year 1993. Growing up, people thought he was slow in the head. He learned from an early age, letting people believe or think this could actually be advantageous for him. He did have a learning disability, but that was partly laziness, procrastination, or lack of interest. It didn't matter to him. Mostly people just left him alone. The old car was covered in thick moss. He still gave the car a wide berth. He felt something was not right about the car. It appeared to him the car was a 1930s model, mid-decade, 1935 perhaps. What intrigued him the most at this point, though, was how the car got here in the first place. There was not a road or trail anywhere close by, and these woods were old growth. It was quite the mystery. He finally decided to get closer, so he approached the car from the rear. He could see it still had a license plate. As he was bent over, removing the thick moss from the license plate, he heard a clicking sound. The sound was coming from the passenger front door. He paused in his tracks. The sound was a window slowly being rolled down. Then the clicking sound stopped. Enoch was unsure of what to do, so he turned and ran away from the vehicle. He ran faster and faster. For the next few weeks, Enoch constantly thought about the old car in the woods. He asked around in a general sort of way about the old car in the woods, but nobody knew anything, except for one old-timer. He mentioned that there was a car that went missing near those woods in the early 1940s. The old-timer was quick to scold Enoch, though. He said no vehicle could be in the middle of those woods unless a helicopter dropped it there. Enoch didn't say anything more about it, but he knew in his heart he was going to return to the car in the woods. Enoch developed an elaborate plan to retrieve the car from the woods. You see, his uncle had a farm close to those woods, and he had an old horse he kept around for sentimental reasons more than anything. Enoch had more or less adopted that old horse. Enoch planned on taking the car apart in pieces and used the old horse to haul them out and back to his uncle's old unused barn. It would take a while, but he knew it could be done. Enoch spent the whole summer taking the old car apart and reassembling it. The day he was finished, he stood back and looked at the job he had done. He was thoroughly proud of himself. And then he remembered something he had forgotten in the trunk. Again he thought to himself, the car is back whole again. Now the next phase, getting it running and restoring it to original. While digging around in the trunk, he heard the radio come to life. And then he heard the motor turn over. In shock, Enoch didn't know what to do. Then the motor shut off. Then the radio. It became deathly quiet. Then he heard the front passenger window slowly being rolled down. Then it stopped. Then he heard someone getting out of the car. Then it spoke. Do you want to take a ride? Upward Look. It's 1939. My name is Dennis. I'm from Salem, Indiana. When I was 20, I left home, which was 1934. It was the height of the Great Depression. My hometown had little or no work to be had. It was a poor region before the Great Depression hit anyway. Growing up, I'd always dreamed of leaving southern Indiana for something more exciting. For something more exciting. When I was 7, a strange woman approached me in the library. She gave me a strange book. The book contained poetry. It awoke something inside me that I didn't know existed. Not long after, I started writing poetry myself. But that's a secret I keep to myself, except for 2 others. From an early age, I loved climbing trees. It was my first passion before I discovered poetry. From time to time, when I was alone, the strange lady would visit me. She said very little, but she would ask me to read the latest poems I'd written. Then she would disappear into thin air. As I grew up, I dreamed of being a worker that built tall buildings. The taller, the better. When I left home for New York City, I had almost nothing. Very little money, 1 change of clothes, my beloved poetry book given to me when I was 7, and a picture of my best friend, Myra. Myra had died many years before I was born, but from an early age, she was always with or near me. When I was 9, she told me where to find her picture. It was hidden in a very old abandoned house under the floor in a secret hiding place. Myra never told me how she died, and I never asked. Whenever the strange lady appeared, Myra would go away, but she would stay close. After arriving in New York City, I was very lucky. I found employment right away, doing exactly what I'd always dreamed of doing. This work, walking steel beams high in the sky, was not for the faint of heart. It took a certain mental aptitude and nerves of steel. Many times I had close calls, but I was always lucky. One day in 1937, I watched a veteran worker get pushed off the steel beam he was straddling. It was a sickening sight. From that day on, I always looked upward. After I saw the worker pushed off the steel beam, I saw something almost entirely invisible, except 2 pink eyes that turned and looked at me. I've seen this form on many occasions. It has killed many while I watched from a distance. One time, I was eating my lunch. I felt something behind me. I instinctively knew its intent was malicious. Slowly, I spoke a few simple words. Be gone. My fear comes from behind, not from below or upward. The malicious thing behind me snickered wildly. Then it grew silent, very silent. So very, very silent. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. I couldn't breathe. So I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, I was staring at 2 pink eyes, blazing with fury. Then it was gone. I felt that my end had been so close. I wanted to end my job as a Skywalker that very day. That night in my room, I told Myra what had happened. She said nothing, just stared out the lone window and softly wept. For weeks, nothing happened. I was starting to forget about the hideous form with those 2 pink, malicious eyes. I'd been told stories by old veteran Skywalkers about the dreaded walk of death. Now I took these stories seriously. One day while working, it was beautiful. Then suddenly the wind picked up, and the sky grew dark almost instantly. All of us workers knew we had to get down quickly, or certain death would follow. As I quickly walked the steel beam, I looked upward. I heard thunder. Then I heard and saw lightning strike a tall building close by. In that second, I made a mistake. I looked forward. A deathly mistake. I saw the form of 2 pink eyes right in front of me. It grabbed my throat and lifted me up. I knew my life was over. So I looked upward. Then the beast with two pink blazing eyes let out an unearthly squeal. It still held me in a steel grip when I felt us pushed over the side. Suddenly, the beast let go. In the split second of falling, I looked upward and saw a bolt of lightning hit the steel beam where I'd just fallen from. In that flash of lightning, I saw the strange lady standing on the steel beam. I could hear the pink-eyed beast falling below me, squealing, squealing, squealing. I knew I would be dead soon. So I looked upward.